Hello again, and welcome back to World War II TV and Italy Week. And we are talking about a huge, massive subject that we may not be able to cover it all today, but that is Italy's Navy in World War II. So from the sublime to the ridiculous, and that tomorrow night with Giulio and WWII, we're talking about a 2-hour battle that took place in a small town. So we're covering a very small event tonight. We're covering a massive event, so it'll be interesting. I have joining me tonight some absolute legends. I mean, Tracking fell from his amazing YouTube channel with 250,000 subscribers, and Alexander Clarke. My tongue's gone all weird now. Alexander Clarke with his massive, great bilge pumps and YouTube channel and blogging and Facebook and Twitter, and Giulio, Italian Military Archives. So people who absolutely know their subject when it comes to Navy. So just as well, because I don't know very much about it. But we have some bullet points we're going to discuss tonight. Otherwise, I fear it's just going to go down endless rabbit holes. So we're going to basically pose some questions, and then we're going to thrash these ideas out, and the guys are going to jump in and talk about some stuff. So we'll put some images up. And the first question we're talking about, and well, it's a statement. Is it a statement? Is it a question? Italy was a minor naval power. I'm going to start with Alex Clarke on this one because I will. Is there a misunderstanding about just the size of Italy's navy in World War II? Do we not can give it enough credit for its just enormity? That's a very
we ignore Italy quite a lot. And here is the simple fact: when World War II begins, they have the bigger, more impressive navy than the Germans. In fact, until Japan joins World War II, the Italians are in many ways the leading naval power in the Axis. Yes, the Germans build up a massive superiority in submarines, but when you're talking about balanced naval forces, when you're talking about the ability to project power and do it really well, the Italians are ahead of them. There is the reason the Royal Navy is quite so worried, A, about the French after they end up surrendering, joining up the Italian Navy and taking over the Mediterranean. B, they have such a large fleet in the Mediterranean in the first place. And then you have the C, the biggest thing with them, and when it comes to the Italian Navy, they concentrate so much of their best to fight them. Admiral Cunningham, probably the best Royal Navy admiral available in World War II. Where's he spending most of his war? Fighting the Italians. Where does HMS Warspite spend a large part of her war? One of the most famous battleships, one of the most important, one of the modified, and actually upgraded Queen Elizabeth class battleships. Where does she spend her time? In the Mediterranean. Where did the other upgraded Queen Elizabeth class battleships spend their time? In the Mediterranean. Where does the Royal Navy send Ark Royal, send armored carriers, send everything it can get to the Mediterranean? Why? Well, not because Italy doesn't matter or they can be ignored, but because they are a very capable naval power. No, they're not on the same size as the Royal Navy or the US Navy, but they're also, by treaty, have been allowed to be the third rank down. So if you consider first rank was America and UK, second rank was Japan, third rank, Italy and France. And that's where they were allowed to be. And they had invested, they built up. And they'd actually had a navy with a viable size for most of the interwar period and in World War I, which meant that unlike the German Navy, they did have a pool of experience. The trouble was they have very good officers from the rank of about captain downwards, and the officers from captain upwards make the officers below from captain downwards want to drink or do other things to try and ignore them and dull the pain.
Right. So, Giulio, as our resident Italian, why do us English-speaking historians, war buffs, why do we have this idea, do you think, why do we dismiss the Italian Navy? What do you think it's due to?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And so, answering your question, there was a narrative after World War II in Italy, but also with that abroad in the English-speaking world, already during the war, I'm thinking about the great debacle in North Africa in 1940, so Operation Compass. Since then, there has been spreading news about and propaganda messages within the Allies on the fact that the Italians were incapable to wage a fight. This was true at that particular moment, but then it changed in a while. But I don't want to open another huge discussion. There was this narrative also after the war, also in the Italian debate. Of course, especially before knowing the existence of Ultra, there were accusations also fomented by the right-wing movements or historians or veterans that they claim that Italy lost the war because the Navy didn't do its job. There were traitors in the Navy informing the British about the movements, so the British could intervene and sink the convoys and so on. Then maybe, I don't know, the myth that the Germans were super efficient and the Italians were the bad fellas in the alliance. All these sort of things that when then you study the actual topic, yeah, you realize, as Alex said, that at the beginning of the war, Italy had an impressive navy for the standards. They had an impressive, I think, one of the largest submarine fleet, which then on paper was impressive, but then during the war it didn't behave according to expectation. But there are reasons also for that. And then, balanced formation of battleship, light cruisers, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. And they are, most importantly, they're at the center of the Mediterranean. Yes, they are facing France and the UK, but then they have the advantage to face the Mediterranean fleet and the Marine Nationale on two separate parts of the Mediterranean, so east and west. But then they are also aware at the beginning of the war that they are fighting the Royal Navy and the French, but then the French disappear after a while. But they are aware they have a potential, but they are the weakest side of on the battlefield, let's say, because Italy is the weakest of the great powers. They don't have the industrial capacity to replenish the losses, especially in capital ships. So they played the strategies, let's say, of the fleet in being. They are there, they pose a threat, and they keep the supply lines to North Africa open. This was the objective of the Regia Marina, not fighting the Royal Navy in an open battle, trying to risk all the ships available that could never be rebuilt.
And we are going to bring up that whole convoys and supply theme. That is one of our bullet points later. So, Drac, you've been waiting patiently to join in. And, you know, you've done an incredible number of videos on YouTube about naval history in all eras. And when the Italian Navy comes up, do you feel like there's a sort of different level? Is the interest the same? Do people have more misconceptions? What generalities have you kind of worked out in doing your channel?
I think a lot of it has come down to the fact that whilst there are some very good books about the Mediterranean conflict, if you were to make a pile of sort of fair to decent to good books on the Mediterranean conflict from either the British or the Italian perspective, at least in the English language, and you were to stack them on one side, and then you stacked all the books that are written about the Battle of the Atlantic, Bismarck, the Norwegian campaign, all the stuff that Kriegsmarine is involved with, you'd end up with sort of probably the Italian pile wouldn't even get into shot of the camera here. Meanwhile, the German pile would be kind of through the ceiling, and I'd be being buried in books. And as a result, because
that would just be the German submarine books.
Yeah, and as a result, because you end up with this massive preponderance of written literature about the Kriegsmarine, people assume, therefore, that the Kriegsmarine must have been the bigger navy, the bigger threat, and most of the stuff in English, at least that I've come across, tends to be about the Italian efforts in the Desert War, which, let's face it, a lot of them don't meet with a tremendous amount of success. And so you kind of get this narrative forming in people's minds that, oh, well, the Italian army wasn't particularly brilliant a lot of the time, and it gets compared very unfavorably to the Africa Corps. And then people kind of look at, oh, well, what do I see about the Italian Navy? Not much. What do I know about the Italian Navy? Well, they didn't win, so therefore they must have been as bad as the Italian army. And you immediately get this mindset that just goes, oh, right, the Italians must have just been rubbish.
But the Germans didn't win either, isn't it? So what that, I mean,
well,
when I was on your bilge pump show, Alex, and I talked about my visit to Saint-Nazaire last year, and they opened the bookshop up for us because it wasn't really open to the public yet. And the stack of books on U-boats, you know, breaking down individual sort of story into 3 volumes, and there was precious little on the British Royal Navy, nothing on the Italian Navy, and it was all German. But I mean, that's not the subject we're talking about tonight. We're not talking about.
It's not an issue, but let's consider. There's an example here, and I know this person is an earnest commentator because I've talked to them before on my own channel. But someone called Under the Great Dominion has just put, arguably the Luftwaffe was the greatest threat to the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, not the Regia Marina or even the Regia Aeronautica, and I know exactly where they get that comment from. That's a very standard comment if you read the histories, because they all talk about the great 1,000 kilogram bombs and all the other things the Kriegsmarine, the Luftwaffe bring in, and all these things. But they forget there's also the Regia Marina submarines. There's the battleships, there's the cruisers, there's the destroyers, there's the mines, there's the mini-subs. They're all taking a toll. The Regia Aeronautica provide far more aircraft attacking the Royal Navy than the Luftwaffe do. Yes, some of them do try doing high-level bombing for a long time during the war. Yeah. And honestly, the Regia Aeronautica's obsession with high-level bombing is only surpassed by the Royal Air Forces. But they still have a lot of torpedo aircraft. They still have aircraft which do dive bombing attacks. And quite a lot of those attacks, when we're talking about them, the less sexy kills, but the far more of them, i.e. the destroyers and the cruisers which get hit, are taken out by Italian aircraft and Italian ships. Because, and don't take this the wrong way, the Germans do have a habit of being glory hogs. If you have a battleship or an aircraft carrier there, all the German aircraft will concentrate on that. And the British actually play to this. This is half the time they want battleships and aircraft carriers along with their groups. It's because they know the Germans, who do actually have the heavier bombs, will concentrate on the big targets, which will allow the smaller ones to be free to fire at them.
Yeah, and Alex, most of the time, the Regia Aeronautica was providing the fighter escort to the Luftwaffe bombers.
Yes.
And don't forget
which, if they didn't have, they would have got mauled long before they got anywhere near the ships.
And two of the other things I always like to point out when it comes to that sort of the aerial aspect of it is, one, when you look through a lot of the history, it'll say, oh, so many Stukas attacked the convoy or the Royal Navy formation. And what a lot of those histories either gloss over or perhaps even don't realize is that the Regia Aeronautica flew Stukas as well. So if a bunch of Stukas show up, it's not Fliegerkorps 10 necessarily. Yes, there could be elements of Fliegerkorps 10. It might be an entirely Fliegerkorps 10 strike, but quite often it would be a combined strike, or it might just be an entirely Regia Aeronautica strike.
Isn't Stuka just a term people would use to describe enemy dive bomb? It's got that 88 Tiger tank kind of thing to it anyway, isn't it? I mean, I know in Normandy there are accounts of Americans saying they came under fire from Stukas, and you go, no, it's a dive bomb of some kind.
And let's be honest, it's like the Luftwaffe. Wherever they're shot down in the world, they're shot down by Spitfires.
Exactly.
Even when the British do not deploy Spitfires anywhere near that region, they are shot down by a Spitfire.
I mean, Alex, you mentioned a second ago about the British being respectful of what Italians are doing. So maybe this is a good time to throw out the other question we have, because we're going to go back and forth. And I realize, folks, there's lots of comments coming in, which is great. We'll try and address some of your specific questions, but this is kind of an opening show, and it's proving very popular, great views. But is that a fair statement we threw up on the screen there, that in 41, the British are more concerned about what the Italians are doing with their ships and designs than they are the Kriegsmarine? Alex, you nodded immediately on that.
They have been for years. Let's be honest. Cuniberti and the start of the Dreadnought program comes about because of Italian theorizing about all big gunships being written down. Other navies had been thinking about it, but the first people to verbalize it, to actually write it down as a coherent report, were the Italians, and that's pre-HMS Dreadnought. And from that point onwards, the Italians are always realized to produce very good ideas. They don't always execute them that well, but other navies will shamelessly look at the Italian Navy and go, ooh, that's a cool idea. You've not done it as well as I can do it, but I will take it. Whereas, let's be honest, if you hear me talking about German destroyers in World War II, usually I'm saying either they got sunk or why did they pick the guns they did for them? Because it looks like they're trying to make mini cruisers, and that doesn't work for a destroyer. If I'm talking about the tribal class, which are the ones I've written a book about, shameless plug, but
plug away.
They are a response to the Italian super destroyers, which are a response to the French super destroyers. The French design, the British look at and go, well, we don't need to worry about super destroyers. Have you seen what the French have built? Then the Italians first go with the Condottieri class light cruisers, which are terrible, work out they're not that great, and then build their own super destroyers. And the British go, oh, okay, we need to build something now, because then the Japanese look at the Italian destroyers and go, we'd like some of that. The Japanese take it, the Brits take it, and the Americans then go, okay, we better have some as well.
Yeah, it's one of those things when you're looking at the naval element of things, if you compare the two European Axis navies, when it comes to destroyers, the Germans usually don't quite get it right. They tend to build big destroyers, but somewhat top-heavy, in some cases hilariously top-heavy, and usually with very unsuitable guns. The Italians actually build, as Dr. Clarke just said, good large destroyers. Italian light cruisers, okay, for the most part, let's ignore those. They're not exactly anything great to write home about, although some of their later designs are quite nice. But then again, the Königsbergs aren't either. At least the Italian light cruisers will stay intact if you take them out to sea, as opposed to the Königsbergs, which just try and twist themselves into tinfoil pretzels. Then you've got the heavy cruisers, and when you come to the heavy cruisers, everyone's building large heavy cruisers. Yes, okay, fine, the Italians are cheating on the heavy cruiser requirements just as much as the Germans are, but the Italians come up with better designs. Because if you compare the Zara class, for example, with the Admiral Hipper class, the Admiral Hipper class is about 40 to 45% greater displacement than the Zaras, but they're the same speed. They've got the same kind of main armament. The Zaras arguably have a much better secondary and anti-aircraft armament, and the Zaras are considerably better protected.
And better handling. Let's be honest. You don't want to get caught in a narrow space in a Hipper. A Zara will maneuver.
So if you put the only thing that Hipper has over the Zara is the Hipper has some torpedo tubes. But come on, if you 45% more displacement, just under 12,000 tons compared to just over 16,000 tons is a heck of a lot to pay for thinner armor and a dozen torpedoes. And then you look at battleships, and I know I've said this before on my channel, and it always does irritate the usual suspects, but if you compare the Bismarck and Littorio designs, yes, the Littorio has a few issues. I'm still not entirely sold on the spaced armor concept of it, but overall, the Littorios are flat out better than the Bismarcks as a design. If the Italian shell manufacturers could get their act together, they'd be completely superior. And again, the Italians managed to pull this off on the Littorios on a design that is considerably lighter than the Bismarcks. Okay, they're a little bit shorter range, but the difference in displacement is nowhere near enough to just account for, the Bismarcks can sail further again. So the Italians do the naval thing better than the Germans, and yet if you look at sort of the pop culture history of the Navy, everyone's going, yes, German naval technology, German efficiency, German excellence. Like, weren't actually that good.
From earlier, Craig Farrar put it up that Paul focused on, which was Craig Farrar said, I just got a new book, a PQ-17 book, and it claims Tirpitz was the world's most formidable warship. In the nicest way, there are a list of battleships I would put ahead of Tirpitz.
He said that he wasn't even the most formidable in that battle, and he did put it in speech mark. He was being
Washington has her outgunned and is better trained. And this is the thing. This is but that is what people will write quite happily.
So
you sit there and go, it's not even the best one on the Axis by a long way, let alone once you have the Allies in.
Because Drac made a pertinent point there about the Italian Navy getting things right. But were they good? And I'm going to bring Giulio on this. Were they as good at the PR side of things? Because one thing you have to hand the Germans with their signal magazines and all that is they knew how to photograph U-boats going out. They knew how to photograph new cruisers coming off the docks and what have you. What was Italy's PR machine like, Giulio? And clearly it wasn't as good at the Germans, but were they... Could they have been better at bigging up what they're producing?
Okay, so huge question, but thing is, the design, they made very nice design, but I would say starting from the late 20s, early 30s, because the destroyer generation, they do a lot of design errors with the first post-World War I destroyers. They have huge stability problems, and the autonomy is also not so great, but they are also meant to fight in the Western Mediterranean against the French, because until 1935, everything in the Regia Marina, from strategies, tactics, and naval construction, are conceived to fight the French. The British pop up at the end of 1935 with the tensions of the war in Abyssinia. So the design takes some time to move on, but at the end they get it right with the thinking about light cruisers, the Montecuccoli, the Duca d'Aosta, the Garibaldi class, the Zara, and so on. The submarines, they had a lot of issues because they had huge, larger towers, so the visibility wise was could hardly hide an Italian submarine compared to a U-boat. And in general, and it's valid for submarines, to destroyers, to every kind of ship in the Regia Marina. The issue was with the electric equipment, the quality of also range finders, optics. Being the weakest of the great powers meant that the industrial apparatus couldn't provide high quality equipment in these categories. So the ships and the ships in the actual operative situation, they suffered from this. Then, of course, there's the huge problem with Air Force Navy coordination. Basically, you have the Regia Aeronautica and the Regia Marina not talking at each other for 15 years. Then in 1941, they realize, maybe we should cooperate a bit more. Maybe we should put the air reconnaissance under the chain of command of the Navy, on the battlefield commander. Until after Matapan, when Admiral Iachino advocates for this, he gets a reply from Supermarina, so the Navy High Command. Yeah, this could endanger our relations with the Regia Aeronautica. So no, but then after a while they realized they have to do something, and they came up with the code of conduct. And in 1942, with the with Operation Vigorous, so the Axis offensive against the Operation Vigorous, Harpoon, Pedestal, all the operations aiming at resupplying Malta, you see a way better airship coordination, which builds on 2 years of experience and of finally the Navy and the Air Force talking at each other. So absolutely.
Can I pick up on one of your earlier points, Giulio? Because first off, if you're not following Italian military archives on Twitter, you're missing out, because he's amazing. Definitely. And he knows this one better than me. But before we get too far away, someone asked a question quickly about the ASW. I think it was great. Dominion came back about the ASW capabilities of Regia Marina destroyers and escorts. Now, the thing was, actually, in 1939, the Albatross tests it. It's one of their sub-chasers, does test their sonar. But they don't manage, because of their industrial capacity is limited, they concentrate on fitting it to their submarines rather than their sub-chasers, which delays it going into service. So they have a good idea. And this is the thing. This doesn't make them a bad Navy. They have a good idea, but they have a limited industry. So they are actually developing their own and putting it in. And it's one of the things that's often at the point, and it's the great point which you're making, Giulio, and it's the key point you have to understand. Just because you don't necessarily have the industrial infrastructure doesn't mean you have bad ideas. It means you have bad infrastructure. And half the trouble for the Italian with its in Italy with its infrastructure is geography of the place.
Also.
It's if you consider where you've got your navy bases for their best positions in the Mediterranean, and you've got your industrial centers and all the territory you have between them, and the coastal convoys they have to do, and all the other things they have to do to try and make it match up. It's just it's a constant battle of organization and logistics. Even in peacetime, when you don't have people like the Royal Navy's 10th flotilla operating from Malta going, hello, we are in, which are literally called U-class submarines, so technically the real U-boats, are sitting off your coast with SBS who will go ashore and blow up your railways and all sorts of other fun things they get up to. And again, the British don't do that for the fun of it. They do it because keeping Italy in trouble is key to keeping control of the Mediterranean, and that's not because Italy is a minor power or not willing to fight.
We'll move into the Mediterranean literally and figuratively in a minute. Does someone want to just address my point about the propaganda side of things? I mean, because just in my prep for this, you know, there's not much comes up for me from World War II of Italy making big about their new ships and their new stuff. Are they? I know that's not really important in terms of what they're producing, but I think it is important to understand where their place sits in the historiography. In that people use Google, they use resources, and there's just so much stuff of German convoys going in and out and fitting on ships and fit. So what did they announce their new ships in an effective way? And if they did, why don't we know about it?
They did to a degree, but I think it's two parts. One of which is that I guess the easiest way to think about it would be these days we have the 24-hour news cycle. So an item comes into the news and then it disappears from the news a couple of days later, and then everyone kind of forgets about it. It wasn't quite that quick back in the 1930s, but there is a certain amount of, it's the same thing. We're tired of hearing about this thing. And Mussolini's regime in Italy was around longer than Hitler's regime in the Third Reich. So when Mussolini took over Italy and had his sort of fascist state, there was a lot of news and a lot of propaganda and everyone was very interested about what was going on at first. And then that interest kind of just died down a bit. And then Hitler came to power, and now the new fascist state was Germany, and now everyone was looking at Germany to see what they had been doing. And because the Italians had kind of I think it was a combination of the fact the Italians had maintained a certain level of credible force throughout the interwar period, whereas the Germans, thanks to the Versailles Treaty and the massive economic collapse in the late 20s and early 30s, were building up almost from nothing. So there was a lot more visible change in Germany, because if the Germans launch Bismarck, it's their first true battleship. If the Italians launch Littorio, it's like their fifth battleship in service. So it's not as much of a big deal.
It's a bigger deal from the Royal Navy's perspective, because that means they've got a decent fleet. From the Germans' perspective, you've got a battleship. How cute!
But also,
that's nice.
The other thing is, I think it's also something of a holdover from the First World War. Because in the First World War, the Italians were on the Allied side for most of it, and two, the Mediterranean in the First World War was mostly dominated by Gallipoli, and a little bit of sort of staring angrily at the Austro-Hungarians over the Adriatic for the most part. There wasn't a tremendous amount of exciting going on there, whereas in the North Sea you had the
do a great mean stare.
Whereas in the North Sea you have the High Seas Fleet. At Battle of Jutland, Battle of Dogger Bank, everyone's looking at that, a really big German fleet. And so when the Germans start rearming in the 1930s, everyone's going, is this High Seas Fleet Mark II? Do we need to worry? They're right across from our shoreline. So in the English-speaking media, everyone looks at the Germans. whereas the Italians are just like, oh, we're just increasing our battle fleet a little bit more in size. And I was like, well, so the only people who are paying attention are the military minds.
Yeah, and until 1934-35, Italy was not perceived as a threat on the political side. It was still in between the allies. The political placement of Italy was not clear. So
it was on the nightmare scenario, but only for Britain. Britain, and France, but that's because France was always worried about Italy, and Italy was always fine. Britain was worried about Italy from two perspectives. One, they thought there was going to be a war between them and the French, and they were honestly not sure which side to come down on, the ones who made pizza or the ones who made baguettes. You know, it's complicated. Do you want pizza supply? Do you want baguettes? It's complicated. Very rude joke there. I do apologize, but you know, it works. The other reason they're worried about Italy is they don't have a small fleet, and if Britain needs to fight a war in the Far East, they need to go through the Mediterranean to get there quickly in the Suez Canal. And if they have to fight a war with Germany, they need to be able to bring their fleet back. So in their worst case scenario, if they can have built a fleet which can deter and control Germany, that's what they're calculating on, and fight a deterrence war with Japan in the Far East while they build up. That's what the Royal Navy is sort of being built for, theoretically. Their nightmare scenario is if you have Italy causing trouble in the middle of that, then you can't combine those fleets. You can't rapidly move ships backwards and forwards if they need to. And that's the problem. That's the big problem. Let's be honest. If you want to make World War II very easy for the Brits, you remove the Italian Navy. Because, if you think about it, the size of the German fleet, not that massive. Doesn't require that much to hold it. If you don't have to make the commitments in the Mediterranean to block off the Italian fleet from getting out and to fight them, to try and interdict their convoys, you have a lot of ships suddenly freed up. A lot of ships.
Let's talk about the Mediterranean. Let's bring that point in there because, you know, I've made this statement, the Battle of the Mediterranean is overlooked. And what's interesting is even finding a single map of the Mediterranean isn't easy because it's bigger than you think it is. And this is only part of it, you know, and it's a complicated theatre to understand and it's ever changing. And you've got the politics and the naval battles and the land battles all happening in this environment. But that's part of the reason it's overlooked, or not so much overlooked as it misunderstood, perhaps.
Because there's so many things going on in the Mediterranean. Because you've got the Desert War in North Africa, and as a result of that, you've got Allied and Italian attempts to supply their respective armies and attack their respective enemies' fortifications all along the coast. Because, to be honest, the transportation routes through the desert are rather appalling, if they exist at all in a lot of cases.
And if you have trucks or trains for them.
Yeah, and then you've got the Italians are trying to keep their forces, and then later the Africa Corps resupplied in convoys coming to and from Italy. You've got the British trying to interdict those convoys from Malta. You've then got the Italian and German efforts to suppress Malta. You've then got the Allied efforts from both the east and western ends of the Mediterranean to reinforce Malta. You've got the Italian fleet's attempts to go out and cripple the British fleet. You've got various critical supplies that the British are trying to get back and forth between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and they, in some cases, they'd really rather not go all the way around Africa. You've got British attempts to shuttle reinforcement ships back and forth, because if a ship's come out British dockyards, they'll have to try and combine it with a convoy run towards Malta, then swap it over to the Mediterranean fleet in the middle of the Mediterranean, then send it back that way, and ships coming back for refit going in reverse. You've got everyone kind of keeping a worried eye on what the French may or may not do in Toulon. To be honest, I was particularly worried about the Spanish Navy, but the British are a little bit worried about what if the Spanish might join the war. And then you've got Vichy French holdings in North Africa. You've got the German invasion into Greece and then into Crete, and that has a whole load of naval involvement as well. So, and that's
after the failed Italian invasion, which, let's be honest, was and then thereafter, obviously, you've got the invasions of Sicily and the invasion of mainland Italy as well. But there's all these various campaigns, apart from those last two invasions, but pretty much they're almost all going on simultaneously.
Yeah.
So everyone's trying to do everything and fight everywhere. And the Italian Navy, and thanks to, as you can see here, with Italy and Sicily basically sitting smack in the middle of the Mediterranean. So anyone who wants to do anything either has to get past them or has to deal with a very real possibility that they might come and try and stop them anyway.
And this is why all the battles in the Mediterranean are pretty much convoy battles. Taranto is a convoy battle, believe it or not. The Royal Navy launches the strike as a cover for convoys going both east and west. The idea was that they'd also have maximum fleets at a time, so if the Italian Navy could be goaded into coming out to fight the British would be very strong, and they could hammer them. That's basically the British plan. It's kind of a reverse of, which other Navy had this plan? Oh, yes, the German plan in World War I. Goad the British into coming out to sea and then hammer a section of them. It's kind of, this is the whole thing. The Mediterranean kind of turns a lot of World War I naval history and a lot of the Battle Atlantic on its head, because the Allies are interdicting convoys, as are the Italians. It's the amount of battles which are literally two convoys, one going east to west, the British convoy, and one going north to south, the Italian convoy, bumping into each other in the middle of the Mediterranean. And we have a battle at this point. And victory in this battle is not who sinks the most ships. It's who gets your supplies through.
I'm glad you brought that, because I was thinking of doing that, because when we had our pre-chat, folks, we were talking about the Battle of the Atlantic being about the Axis trying to stop the Allied convoys back and forth. And you made the point, one of you or all of you, that the Mediterranean is the opposite. Basically, it's about the Allies trying to stop the Axis convoys, and also the Axis trying to stop our convoys. And Giulio's done some amazing work we'll come up later on with about the data. Actually, we've got some graphs again for you folks. We broke our graph duck a week or so ago on with Samantha Cowan talking about tourism. We had our first graph in a year. We've got like 9 graphs coming up later on. And I think you made that really good point a minute ago, Alex, about this measuring of naval success by ship-on-ship action in this top trumps kind of way. You've lost that amount, we've lost that amount, score that up as a victory there. And you're saying, all of you, that judging the Italian Navy by that is not the fairest way of judging, or judging indeed any Navy.
And even if you're judging the Allied success with the whole supplies getting from Italy to North Africa, the Regia Marina does a great job of this. And I will say that because if Giulio says that later, which he will do, everyone will say it's an Italian saying it, so of course he's saying it. Sorry, no, it's true. They do. Rommel lies, but we'll get on to Rommel and his inability to do logistics later. Yeah. But the thing is, what matters to the British in terms of trying to stop the Italian convoys getting through isn't stopping the convoys. They don't have enough forces to do that because the Italian Navy is that strong. What they're trying to do is stop them getting to the ports close enough to the front line, because they know that from their own intelligence that Rommel and the Africa Corps, and therefore unfortunately the Italian commanders in North Africa as well, are kind of forced to adopt a policy of logistics as something that happens to other people.
Yeah, and if I may add on the convoys, the Regia Marina does its job in pushing the convoys through. Yeah, there are peaks of losses, of course, but one thing that we tend to forget, beside, I saw comments on that, on the capacity of the Libyan ports. I mean, Drac mentioned the distance between the ports and the front line, the absence of railways, the absence of lorries, and so on.
The fact
and the
that
capacity,
Renault, Opel, and all the other lorries they were using were terrible for various different reasons.
The low capacity of the Libyan ports to receive ships and shipping from the merchant ships. But then we have to remember that also for this, the Regia Marina basically kept between 1 and 2 convoys at sea per day from June 1940 to May 1943, when the North African campaign was over. There were basically from 1 to 2 ships, 2 merchant ships at sea, with 1 to 2 escort per convoy. And this includes it's valid for Libya, later Tunisia, but also at the same time we forget that Italy had to supply the let's say the Greek front with after the great idea of Mussolini of invading Greece out of nowhere. The Regia Marina organized a lot of convoys supplying Albania, later Greece, also the Dodecanese, so the islands in front of Turkey, which were another potential threat. They were not used at the best of their potential, but so. What I'm saying that the Regia Marina had warships and merchant ships at sea every day for 39 months. No, 39,
which is possibly a good
31
time
months.
to mention Taranto, because there's this idea that after Taranto, it's all over and no so let's address that elephant in the room there first. And this reference to it being Italy's Pearl Harbor and this, what are our feelings about that? Is it a distraction? Is it important? How do we assess that? Is it too well known? Is it people don't know enough beyond it?
It's well known, but not enough of its context is known. It's one of those things, as I said, it's part of a convoy battle, and the British, it is an excellent strike, but it's limited because the British only have one of the two carriers they wanted to take available. So that cuts their strike aircraft, but they have been planning to take in by a third to 50%, depending on how you put together the air groups and how many spare aircraft they managed to get working. But you have to remember they were using Swordfish, which could be literally held together with some nylon straps from the nearest Wrens underwire. There are so many stories of that happening that I'm surprised the Royal Navy had any Wrens in it by the end of 1942. Leaving that to one side.
I can't like the idea of going down that rabbit hole, but we won't. We must resist. We can do another show on that.
Actually, if you're going to do that show, you have to get a guy called Steve George on, because he has the best stories about that, because he learnt them all as an engineer in the Navy later on when they were passing on through the folklore. So the thing is, Taranto happens, and it's portrayed as this massive victory because Britain needs a victory at this point. So that fuels its propaganda. It is a very big victory because it does damage a significant number of the Italian battleships. However, as we pointed out before, the Italian Navy is not a one-shot pony, a one-trick pony. They're not this. They're not just a case of, you've damaged our battleships. Well, we've actually got some new ones entering service, and we've also got a load of very decent cruisers, destroyers, submarines. So we're out at sea quite quickly. This is the thing. The Italian Navy, if you'd done that to the German Navy at that point, you'd taken out that many of their capital ships in one go, the German Navy would have ceased to exist as a surface force.
Well, at that point, at the time of Taranto, the German Navy didn't have 3 battleships to sink.
Yeah, no, the Royal Navy, it was just a case of this is the point about Taranto. The reason it's so big is because the Italians are the major naval power of the Axis at that point. Sinking their battleships or disabling them, even for a few months, is quite critical. And the fact that the Italians have their battleships, which aren't damaged, out at sea quite soon afterwards, operating with cruisers, with destroyers, a full fleet, it's because they are a capable navy.
And I mean, if the other thing is, like, in terms of did the Italian fleet come out after Taranto? Well, if you look at the timeline of the big or the large, I guess, naval engagements where you have surface ships in large numbers shooting at each other, before Taranto, you have Calabria.
Yeah.
That's it. There's Warspite versus Giulio Cesare. Okay, yeah, there's something of note there. That's it. After Taranto, you get Cape Spartivento, Matapan, both battles of Sirte. These are the big battles that the large sort of surface actions that people think about quite a lot when it comes to the Mediterranean.
And they know about them. This is the problem.
And we're going to bring up the Battle of Sirte later on.
It is, yes, I have come with a phrase for it, which is being used.
But the point is that all but one of the big surface actions happen after Taranto.
Yeah.
But to be honest, my personal opinion of Taranto is that although obviously yes, it's a very big tactical success in and of itself, probably its single biggest long-term effect was giving Admiral Iachino post-traumatic stress disorder whenever he heard the name Warspite or saw Nightfall coming, because he suddenly became almost very, very hyper conscious about what could happen if night came and there were British ships nearby, to the point of going from beforehand ignoring things to his cost, and after Taranto and after Matapan, there's a combination. After that, he's seeing British ships in the shadows whenever the sun so much as goes near the horizon. But that's not a material effect.
No, you can't measure it.
Yeah, but
no, you can't measure it. It's interesting.
It's more important from the perspective it gives the Royal Navy's confidence in its fleet air arm strike capability. That's its other big effect. It's a psychological impact on both sides. For the Royal Navy, it signals that all that investment during the 1920s and 30s, all that fighting with the Royal Air Force and the Air Ministry for control of the fleet air arm has been worth it. They've got their strike. They've got their strike capability. They have got their Sunday sucker punch if they need it. And that's another reason it adds to the PR thing, because it's so important. It's part of the foundational myth of the fleet air arm. And every time someone writes a history of naval aviation now, because the fleet air arm does so much in it, it gets written into it. So it gets magnified. And it's kind of like we were talking at that quote earlier about Tirpitz. In that, Tirpitz is actually, no, it's not. There is no way in a world that Tirpitz is an okay battleship. We'll just leave that to one side. That was a bad suggestion. I almost said Tirpitz was all right as a battleship. It's not. But we'll leave that to one side.
Yeah.
Taranto is a very good strike for the British and in the context of the time. It doesn't cripple the Italian Navy. They're still operational. There's still actions afterwards. What it does do is it shows what naval aviation is capable of, and that's important.
Yeah,
and that's why it becomes big.
It serves a place in the history, like the Battle of Britain, or there's the real military on the sea effect, and then there's the psychological effect. There's the boost to the morale. There's workers in factories working hard, all that kind of stuff. Because the purpose of this show is to kind of give people an idea the Italian Navy is better than a lot of people think. Let's go back to the convoys to Rommel, because it came up earlier on. And we've got some good data here, because that's one of the things you come up is that, well, you said yourself, Alex, Rommel is blaming everybody but himself and his own mastery or lack of mastery of logistics. He's blaming the fact he's not getting the supplies. You've done some incredible work here about so Giulio, could you bring us through some of the stuff you worked out, because this is all your work here. So run us through why you would put this information together first, because you didn't put it together for this show. You've been working on this for some time. So why do you think it's important that we understand what you've worked out?
I took this data from let's say my Bible on the Italian Navy, on the Regia Marina, which is there are actually 3 books on the Regia Marina written by perhaps the biggest Italian naval historian that were never translated into English. And when I approached this book and I saw the figures, he basically says, what we said before, the Regia Marina did its job, because the objective was not to destroy the Mediterranean fleet. The objective was to keep the supplies to Libya, the supply lines open. And then when you look at the data, you see, most of the staff and the personnel arrived.
We'll go through these. So basically, folks, orange is what they actually got, blue is what they sent out, and you can see in most cases, most of it gets through. We'll touch on exactly whether it goes to the right place in a minute, but this is amazing data. I found this really interesting.
Just to give you the percentage, regarding the convoys to Libya, if I remember correctly, 93% of the personnel shipped arrived destination, while for the equipment, so weapons, fuel, etc., 86%. It's true that there were monthly peaks up and down. Of course, we know that the Regia Marina has some problems in the second half of 1941, especially at the end when the Operation Crusader takes place. And those peaks in losses are instrumental for the also for the victory of the Commonwealth forces in Operation Crusader. And then, of course, in the second half, late 1942, there are other problems. But at that point, the strategic situation is
It's changing anyway.
It's compromised already. So that's the point.
But I mean, that graph there is pretty amazing. I mean, I'm not a Navy geek, but I find that really interesting. That because I've grown up from the land warfare, reading about Rommel, and this is important stuff that you've done here.
Yeah, the thing is that you don't have to blame the Regia Marina. Yeah, they lost the war, of course, and they lost badly in a way, but they stood to their objectives. They pushed the stuff through, and of course you have to consider the geography of the theater in Libya. I mean the logistic lines and lots of other problems that the Navy had little to do about.
And if you go back to the previous slide, can I just ask? Now, if you look October, November, December, where it goes down, that's when Britain, in 1942, and I think in 1941 as well, that's when you have Force K operating from Malta, which the British try to supply, but they can't sustain there because they can't get enough supplies through to Malta. Yeah. When it's operating, they can do big things. In 1941, there's the Battle of the Duisburg Convoy, which is a great attack for the British. But let's be honest, it's actually quite a dangerous one as well for the British, because you're up against, because the Italians do put such heavy escorts on their ships going across, it's actually a battle. In fact, the British turn up with 2 cruisers and 2 large destroyers to take on the fight, to carry out the fight, not because the Italians are so easy, but because the Italians have some good destroyers there. They have good ships there. It's going to be a battle.
Yeah, and at the end of 1941, they also deployed the battleships to defend the convoys, because they have to send the supplies, no matter the cost, and they sent the battleships out. They also ran military convoys, so they packed the cruisers and destroyers with fuel barrels, and sometimes it ends not
the
very
Battle
well.
of Cape Bon, where unfortunately a couple of the condottieri got caught by... two tribal class destroyers, Isaac Squeers and a L-class destroyer from memory, Legion, I think, and unfortunately they get torpedoed at night and just
they sunk the Giussano and the Barbiano cruiser.
But just for clarification, Alex, I know we talked about it in our pre-show. Yeah, as we've proven there with the data, that the convoys are getting through to North Africa, but the problem was the ports and where they go to and transport to the side. So how have we ended up with a situation where Rommel kind of blamed the lack of supplies coming through? What actually happened on the ground?
Let's put it this way. We're talking about the German war effort after World War II. The Germans are great self-publication. The amount of books which come out which say how great generals we were, despite we lost to everyone in the end. But no, that wasn't because we were bad generals. That was because of, well, let's blame everything on Hitler, or let's blame everything on the Italians. And I'm not saying Hitler was a nice guy or a smart guy, but honestly, I'm sorry, but some of the things he gets blamed with by the generals, you would think he was on the phone, radio to them 24 hours a day, telling them what to do. He's not. He's not got the time in the day, and he's honestly not that interested. He's most of the time eating bad vegetarian food, from what I can, I understand.
You get this with the ground, the generals in the ground. It's easy to. The best people to blame are the people who are dead, aren't they? Whether they're good or bad, if they're dead, they can't speak back. So rather than people judge your efforts, blame the dead guy or dead guys or dead nations, whatever you want to call it. So what was happening with the convoys are going to these ports, the Libyan ports? Who wants to break down the significance and how that works?
So basically what the problem is when it comes to the ports is that you can have a port, but that port can be of varying sizes. And even if you've got a large port, if it doesn't have the infrastructure, the piers, the wharves, the quays, the cranes, the roads, the railways, etc., you can only unload a certain amount of supplies per day. And so whilst there are quite a few ports along the North African coast, the vast majority of them really can't actually unload all that much. There's a few key ones. It's one of the reasons why Tobruk is fought over so much, because it's one of the larger ports. But it means that effectively, there are certain suppliers. For the British, obviously, it's Alexandria. For the Axis, it's mostly Tripoli, and one or two others. And then Tobruk's kind of the one in the middle that everyone fights over. All the other little ones, they're useful for getting small amounts of supplies closer to the front line, but you can't sustain an entire army from it. And I think one of the ultimate refutations of Rommel blaming the Italians for his supply problems is actually to look at the nature of the Desert War. The nature of the Desert War, if you look at it on an animated map and speed it up, it almost looks like a tennis match. Yeah, everyone's going duh, 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 duh. And the reason for that is because when one side is pressed closer to their central supply points, they can build up the fuel, the ammo, the tanks, etc., to fight back, and the other guy is at the extreme end of their land-based supply lines, and they can't sustain it. But when they get pushed back, all of a sudden they find they have the supplies now because their supply lines have been shortened and the other guys have been lengthened. If everything that Rommel says about the Italians being useless at getting his supplies through was true, then what should have happened is the first time he got pushed back, he should have just collapsed because there wouldn't have been the supplies there for him to restock, resupply, and rebuild his forces, regardless of any British supply problems. But what actually happens is he gets pushed back, and oh look, the supplies are there, and he's able to build up his forces again because the Italians are getting the stuff through. And it's only much later on, once you get obviously Operation Torch on, so now they're coming in from both sides, and just the general Allied war effort is building up and up and up to a point where some of Montgomery's tactics do, obviously there's a whole, as you probably know better than I do, there's massive debate about Montgomery and his tactics, but when you look at something like El Alamein, it's literally just, we will line up lots of artillery and lots of tanks and stupendous amounts of explosives and flatten everything in front of us because we can. That's as much a battle of logistics.
It's an attrition.
Look, the copious application of high explosives is something the Royal Navy can appreciate. So let's be honest.
But it's a logistics. It's a logistics thing.
It's an attritional. El Alamein at the end was a battle of attrition that it was easier for the British to win because they were closer to the supply lines, and because not so much. This is another issue. The supplies were arriving to Libya for the Axis, but then you could question, where are they sending enough stuff? I mean, Italy had its limits. For instance, just to put down some numbers, that the main tanks built by Italy, so the M13 and the M14, they built around 1,400 tanks from 1940 to 1943. So it's not a lot. So there's also this issue. The amount of stuff arriving. Also, supplies
you can't
that arrive
stuff which doesn't exist, basically.
Sorry,
you can't send stuff which doesn't exist. And again, it goes back to Italy as an industrial power.
Yeah, and then just to link up what Drax said before, the capacity of the Libyan ports, the fact that there were ships at sea every day en route to Libya, and the fact that when we think about the Mediterranean convoys, the Italian convoys, we don't have to think about large convoys. In average, there were 2 ships, 2 merchant ships and 2 escort ships. This also because, as we said, the capacity of the Libyan ports was limited, and you could not, let's say, handle more than 2, 3, 4, 5 ships, depending on the port, at the same time. So there was a constant flow, and this constant flow meant consumption of fuel, exhaustion of the torpedo boats, of the destroyers escorting. At the end of the war, you see the battle fleet, the battleships are almost intact, beside the Cavour, who was semi-sunk and never fully put back into service. When you look at the destroyers, Italy started the war with 51, 52 destroyers. At the end, there are like 10, maybe less, surviving destroyers. Also, the torpedo boats have been depleted because they were the workhorses of the Battle of the Convoys.
And it is down to convoys, isn't it? So I'm conscious of the fact we've been at it an hour now. So what do we want to do next? Do we want to do Battle of Sirte or do we want to do Malta? What do you want to go into? And then we can go back and follow up some things people ask us. What do you want to do next? Do you want to bring
Search
Malta up? Malta came up a minute ago.
You choose, guys.
Let's do Sirte, because everyone's going to already asking about Malta, and the thing is, Sirte is the coolest battle you've never heard of.
And you wanted to bring
Sirte.
Sirte. You're the one who came up with the little tagline for what we're going to call this bit.
Yeah.
And technically, it's two battles. You get two for the price of one, don't you?
There are two of these battles, and people haven't heard of them. And you sort of sit there and listen to you listen to some of the battles that they get in, that people discuss and write whole books about, and whole big movies are set about them practically. And you go, but those are minor things. If you consider the first battle of Sirte, and I'm going to check this to make sure I get it all right in terms of forces you've got involved. First battle of Sirte involves 5 light cruisers and 14 destroyers on the British side. The Italian side, 4 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Let's be honest, that's a freaking nightmare for the Royal Navy coming towards them.
Yeah.
That is a case of, we've got 5 light cruisers and a few destroyers. You're bringing the entire freaking fleet.
Because the
supplies
have
the Italians have gone back and got their dads and their dads' friends for this
Let's
fight.
be honest, if the German Navy could have ever put such a force like that into action, the British would have been having kittens in the North Sea. This is the thing. If the Kriegsmarine never deployed a task group like that, literally the closest they get to it is Operation Wurzburg, and even that isn't a task group like that. You know, this is a huge task force. And then, you know, if you look at sort of the Mediterranean battles and the various ones that come up, you then have the second Battle of Sirte, and that's equally nasty for the Royal Navy. It's just, this is not an experience that you want to be in if you're the Royal Navy. The second Battle of Sirte involves 4 light cruisers, an anti-aircraft cruiser, 18 destroyers, and a submarine. The force is put under the command of Philip Vian, who, if anyone knows from my channel, had started World War II in charge of tribal-class destroyers, is pretty much the most aggressive naval officer the Royal Navy has at this point, bar none. He was the guy who charged in to the Altmark incident and has sent to recover the British prisoners of war on the Altmark. He has charged Bismarck in 4 destroyers. The things he's done is complete. No, he's in charge for the second Battle of Sirte of the British against the Erminio, who's got a battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 10 destroyers, and a submarine. And at best, you can call it a draw, but both sides get their supplies through and sort of get on. But it's still a freaking nightmare for them.
In the second Sirte, there is no Axis convoy. Giacchino just went at sea to intercept.
It's a complete reverse of the tradition. It's they're at sea to intercept our convoy. They're not supposed to do this.
I mean, for the regard of the first battle, sir, let's look at December 1941 for a start. You've got Wake Island's happening. Pearl Harbor's just happened. You've got invasion of Hong Kong. There's an awful lot happening around the world. And as I've addressed it on World War II TV before, I think a lot of us can only really deal with one timeline at a time. World War II goes from one battle to another battle. And if there happen to be 2 or 3 battles in the same week, we pick the big one and we ignore the other 2. And that's always the case, isn't it? So it's they didn't set a very good week for these battles for them to be remembered by history. But give us a brief summary of the outcome of the 2 battles. Drac, I'll bring you in on these for those who don't know.
Yeah. Well, and just as a quick passing note, at the first Battle of Sirte, where you've got the 4 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 13 destroyers in the Italian fleet. Once again, need I point out, this is not the full strength of the Italian fleet, but 4 battleships and 5 cruisers is more than the Kriegsmarine could physically bring to bear at that point, even if every single remaining cruiser and battleship in the entire Kriegsmarine was made operational and topped up with fuel by a magical hand wave. The Italians are putting more heavy forces into this one battle than the Regia Marina physically possess at this point.
And that's worth underlying that statement there, isn't it? That we said at the beginning, I briefed these guys and said we want to come out with some kind of doozy sort of soundbite quotes, and that one there you just gave us, Drac, and that's why you've got 250,000 subscribers and you're very good at what you do. That sums it up perfectly. The Regia Marine could have wet dreams about deploying this amount of ships in one battle.
Yeah, exactly.
They were probably having wet dreams about deploying this many ships.
But first cert, so you have both sides sort of coming into conflict, but Cunningham is really on a bit of a hiding to nothing here, because he only has his strongest forces are 5 light cruisers. So basically, he has to play keep away and put up a lot of smoke screens to deter the Italians from coming after him. There are convoys for both sides coming through, and they're trying to interdict each other's convoys. Technically speaking, both sides' convoys actually get through, but there is a little bit of an issue with where those ships actually end up going. But there's a reason it's tactically inconclusive, because basically the British cannot take on the Italian force. They know full well if they sail in to try and engage the Italian heavy ships in a full-on gun battle, that is pretty much going to be the end of them. The only thing that they really have going for them at this point is that because of Matapan, the Italians are a little bit careful about going anywhere near anything that might involve limited visibility, and the British, hence all the smoke screens. So as a result, what on paper should have been a walkover victory for the Italian fleet, they're content enough to get their ships through. Giulio, do you want to drop in on that?
Giacchino basically has to protect the convoy at all costs, and the battle in itself is, I think, 10 minutes fire exchange. The Littorio fired 27 shots, the Andrea Doria fired 10 shots, the Giulio Cesare never fired, and then there were 80 shots fired from the heavy cruisers. So he sends his force to keep the British away from the convoy, and then he sails back to avoid the night fighting. But by the time the convoy is safe,
then we have,
and that's what the battle's for. It's a convoy battle.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go.
I was going to say, then we have second cert. So second cert is
I say the last thing on the first the convoys get through, and those convoys are instrumental we are in December 1941, so there's Crusader ongoing. These convoys are instrumental for Rommel to counterattack already in January 1942, so there are lots of strategic implications here. So sorry.
So that's right. And then we get to second cert. So at second cert, again, it's seen as somewhat inconclusive in and of itself as a battle. It's very similar on the British side in that they've only got light cruisers. They do have a slight superiority in destroyers, which again makes the Italians very nervous because they don't want to get near British ships that are throwing up a lot of smoke. It's, again, the limited visibility and British ships armed with torpedoes and guns, not a good combination as far as they're concerned. The Italians don't have quite as many ships present at second cert as at first cert, but they still have a predominance of the heavy ships. They've got a battleship, they've got some heavy cruisers, etc. But again, it's this kind of game of keep away where the Italians sensibly will not charge through a smoke screen, knowing that there's a dozen plus British destroyers waiting on the other side. The British are popping through the smoke screen, they're volleying shells at the Italians and then running away again before the Italians can zero in on their positions, with a little bit of sort of splinter damage and such, like going back and forth, and a couple of minor shell hits. But whilst at sunset, it appears that it's been yet another skirmish, and the British are sort of saying, well, we can kind of count this as a win because we didn't lose and we had the much inferior force. Where the after effects of this battle are felt are well down the line, because again, this is a convoy battle. This time the Italians don't have a convoy, but the British convoy has had to divert in order to avoid the Italian ships. That means instead of getting through the worst part of the Mediterranean for them under the cover of darkness, they are still there come dawn, and then aircraft show up and things go horribly wrong. A lot of the convoy is sunk, and that then leads to further operations, because this convoy was supposed to, amongst other things, try and bring some supplies into Malta.
Yeah.
And because those supplies don't get there, the Allies are now faced with having to launch another convoy to try and get to Malta. And then you end up with Operation Harpoon. And that gets quite heavily worked over by Axis forces. And so therefore you get Operation Vigorous. That gets quite heavily worked over by Axis forces. And so you get Operation Pedestal. And that gets worked over quite heavily by Axis forces. And by the end of those three big convoy battles, the Allied fleet is down 6 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and an aircraft carrier, all sunk. Multiple merchant ships sunk, some of which are very valuable, fast merchant ships, and sort of 3 or 4 times that much in damaged and badly damaged merchant ships and warships. So all of those are basically knock-on from Second Sirte. If that convoy had gotten through pretty much intact, then A, the need for those 3 operations would have been much reduced, and B, they could have been timed a lot better rather than Malta's running out of stuff. We need to get this through now.
And those kind of battles that have a knock-on effect and an influence are interesting, obviously, and they're important, obviously. And it's coming back to this ultimate theme that we're trying to discuss tonight is this, I'm going to use the word misrepresentation or misunderstanding of the role of the Italian Navy. And Malta has come up in again now, and it's come up, people have asked questions already. So how does Malta, this is a broad question, you're going to go, oh, it's such a stupid question, but how does Malta affect the reputation of the Regia Marina? It's not, I obviously can't give you a one line to that, but give me something about how Malta affects the story.
Because Malta's the untaken, unsinkable aircraft carrier, it's basically presumed that the Regia Marina was terrible because they didn't manage to take Malta. Let's be honest, amphibious operations are tough in the best of times. Yeah. The Germans and Italians managed to take Crete by a massive air attack, a loss of luck, and the British being the most disorganized, dysfunctional ground forces ever known to mankind. This is not taking apart. I'm not saying the individual troops and units didn't fight well. They did.
Yeah.
It's the command structure above them. They'd gone through 4 ground commanders in about the space of 4 weeks, each one arriving, trying to get some plans, and then being superseded and told, no, forget your plans. New commander will come up with plans.
Crete has a bit of a connection to like the French army in 1940, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It just badly organized at the top.
Yeah.
Just and we won't even get started on the logistics and the various things in Crete and all the things. But because Crete's taken and Malta isn't, it said, well, if they'd been any good, they could have taken Malta. Malta is very different to Crete. They've been there. The British have been there for a while. It's got defenses in depth. And let's be honest, Malta's been being built as a large fortress since the time of the Crusades, if not before, thanks to the Knights of St. John. Malta is one very large mound of rubble and fortifications. And it's full of very angry people who are very passionately Maltese and especially do not want any Italians coming anywhere near them. It's not a good place to try and invade. On any day of the week.
Plus, the Regia Marina had no experience with amphibious operations. No. There were no landing crafts, so there were no. And Italy didn't possess the paratroopers at the start of the war.
So, and to be perfectly honest,
but not taking on something that you're not suited to and wouldn't be able to achieve is not a good way of measuring a nation's ability, is it? I mean,
No.
it's the opposite of a good way of assessing. And
It's
Yeah,
rather
that's true.
sensible.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's saying that they know what they can do and know what they can't do. And
the Regia Marina prior to the war, they studied the possibility to invade Malta, but yeah, they came to the conclusion that it was very risky and probably could have ended up in a failure. So the idea was to keep it under constant bombardment from the air, and this is what happened. And at the end, Malta was dangerous for the Axis supply lines. As we said, at the end, in the second half of 1941, the time when the Force K was deployed there, but don't forget the British submarines operating from
10th
Malta.
Flotilla. I've done an entire video about them. They are one of my favorite units in World War II. They are completely forgotten from history.
Yeah.
When you start talking about the British submarines, people go, "Oh, the Germans had submarines." No, one of the largest submarine forces in the world was the Royal Navy. Right through the interwar period. In fact, many points they were the largest in the world, largest submarine force in the world. They were one of the most experienced submarine forces in the world. They are full of some very, very skilled submariners and very nasty submariners when you're on the other side of them.
True.
10th Flotilla are a crack unit. They are put in Malta with orders to sink, burn, destroy anything with an Italian or German flag which happens to cross the ocean in front of you. And they do it. They fire a lot of torpedoes. Sometimes they miss, which Giulio's graph nicely points out. But they do create a nice circle around Malta, which basically the Italians go, we prefer to not drive a convoy through it.
So at the end, Malta, posed a threat. It didn't stop the supply lines. Of course, it creates problems when at certain crucial moments, of course. But then I'm questioning: was it more Malta the problem, or again the Libyan ports, the logistic chain, the stuff arriving, the quality of the stuff, the amount of the stuff? So,
and there's a few things you've also got to remember about Malta, because it's not just about how long have the British held it. Malta has been built up as a fortress in an attempt to make sure it cannot be taken for hundreds upon hundreds of years. There's the siege of Malta back in the era of the Crusades by the Ottoman Empire. They didn't take it either. And whilst, sort of a castle is not necessarily a modern fortification by World War II standards, turns out actually star forts are a really good place to put anti-aircraft guns, because the walls are really good at stopping shrapnel and bomb blasts. And even in a shore bombardment scenario, again, they're not the latest and greatest, but massive thick castle walls still have a resistive power of their own. And Malta's terrain, as Carl von Gazenberg was pointing out in the chat, is not exactly shall we say, accommodating to parachuters, because Crete, you had the Fallschirmjäger go in, took horrible losses, but they did have somewhere to land. If you try and parachute into Malta, you're basically asking, which ankle would you like broken? And that's assuming you don't parachute over somewhere like Valletta, where every anti-aircraft gun and its dog is going to be like, oh, thank you very much. So you're not sending paratroopers in. Yeah, you're not sending paratroopers in, even if you want to, even if you had them. You're going up against an island that's been built up for the better part of a millennia, specifically against the idea of being attacked from the sea. It's got quite a lot of defenses. It's a linchpin of Allied power. The Allies will throw their own everything and the kitchen sink at it to try and make sure you don't take it. And one of the other big problems, which any kind of invasion of Malta poses, especially for the Italian Navy, is it fixes you in place. The Italian Navy, sometimes to their own detriment, but a lot of times to their benefit, have focused a lot of effort in making their fleet very mobile. All their ships, there's no Italian warship in frontline service, with the exception of the refitted battleships, that is slower than 30 knots. And it's one of the things that saves them in a lot of circumstances, because they can withdraw and the British can't pursue. They can chase them, but the Italians will draw ahead. And even if there's an Italian ship that's damaged, the amount of speed that it drops by often is not enough. Like in the run up to Matapan, when Vittorio Veneto is hit, once it gets working up again, even damaged, it can work up to a speed that the Queen Elizabeth can't overhaul it. And that there is security in mobility. If you're invading, you're now fixed to, I'm invading this island, or I'm attacking this beach, or I'm attacking this harbor. And that means that, especially by the mid to latter part of the Mediterranean campaign, the Allies can then try and bring superior power to bear because you can't leave.
Let's be honest, there will be a night torpedo attack by destroyers if you try and attack Malta. There will be air attacks from a carrier if it's available. The British will be able to get their battleships out there. And this is the other point I always make about World War II. Where does the RN put its R-class battleships? The ones which they really, really don't think are that great. They go to the Indian Ocean to escort convoys, and they're in the Atlantic escorting convoys. Where are they not put? Nowhere where they could run into an Italian battleship if you can keep them as far away from them, please. Thank you very much. So they're in places where they could run into a German battleship, possibly a Japanese battlecruiser, but not an Italian battleship. And why? Well, they don't have radar, but the Italians have very good optics, very good gunners, and if they actually had some quality control that day on their shells, they're going to get very accurate on you.
Yeah. Well, that's a good time generally, because we've had a few comments earlier to talk about some of the specifics about the strengths and weaknesses of the Italians. So the shells issue comes up frequently, and for anyone who doesn't get that, we'll have one of you explain that in a minute. But what are they good at? You mentioned their optics are good. If you want to run through a list of things, 10 things that they're good at, and maybe bad at, so we get an idea what we're talking about.
Crew training.
In comparison,
crew training I would put up top the thing. The Italian crews are very well trained. They are very good, and this underpins a lot of what they achieve. Their officers, their frogmen are very good. They, of course, do several famous attacks. There's a nice movie made about that. Their submariners, one of their submarines, and I've forgotten its name, but sorry, apologies, Giulio, I will remember this, but it managed to go the whole way around Africa.
The Perla.
To get back. The Perla. And, their submarines do some great operations. And remember, their submarines had got some early experience in war fighting thanks to the Spanish Civil War, where technically they were, the nationalist forces. It was pirates doing with submarines, because pirates often have submarines.
Yeah.
But, the Italians have very good submarines, very good crew training, and I'm going to shut up now because I spoke over Drac when he's
good submarines, good training. Drac, give me another one.
But the quality of the submarines was not that good.
The quality of the crew, I think the quality of crews. When it comes to the Italians, I think in the Navy, the two simultaneously biggest strengths and weaknesses are gunnery and personnel. And the reason I say there's strengths and weaknesses is because there's different aspects to both of those categories. The Italian crews, when they are well led, especially, and I've said this before on my channel, there's almost an inverse relationship between proximity of flag officers and success. So the more an Italian admiral is present, the less likely you are to succeed. The further away the admiral is, and so the more the crew and the captains can actually put their own skills to work, the more and more they succeed. That's why Mars boats, and I'm probably going to butcher this, Maiale. There you go. So the basic, well, they call them human torpedoes, but they're not. Destroyer actions, etc., and even some of the cruiser actions. These are successful because it's the crews and the captains exercising their training and their expertise. It's the bigger battles where the admirals get involved that tend not to go quite so well. And the other aspect to say is the gunnery, because oh my goodness, did the Italians put so many optical rangefinders on their battleships? The Littorio class has duplex and triplex optical rangefinders all over the place. I think they probably absorb a good chunk of all lens manufacture for some years. And it shows, this is the thing, the fire control systems combined with these so many different ranges they're getting off the optical rangefinders mean that they can actually get hilariously accurate, hilariously quickly when it comes to shooting at long range.
Such the British at some points do presume they have radar.
Yeah. The problem, the one problem they have, and this is why the gunnery is a strength and a weakness, is the shells.
Yeah.
Because there's been recently been an article published which talks, I think it's in Warship International, which talks about a new theory that potentially the shells were actually too stable. In that, when a shell goes up, it's supposed to go up and then it's supposed to come down. And there's this. I haven't read the article in full yet, but the theory posits that it was the shells were so stable they went up and they just kept going up, even when they were going down. They just stayed at this kind of upwards angle, which would compromise their flight properties.
Yeah.
The older narrative, which is supported by some documentation about margins of error, and also by Admiral Aquino's autobiography, is that the shell quality control at the point of manufacture just wasn't good enough. And I still tend to veer more towards that, because the gunnery accuracy, that are you getting shells to fall around your target, is consistent. So that's your fire control systems, your range finders, etc. What isn't consistent is how tight the groupings of those shells are, and that's the important thing, because if you're landing your shells, sort of, if you like, on target, a ship might be a few hundred meters long, so you want your scatter to be about a few hundred meters, because then you can guarantee at least one or two of the shells in that salvo will hit. And what happens is, some battles you get shell spreads that are over a kilometer. There's shots from some battles where British cruisers are being fired at, and you know which ship is the target, because the Italian logs tell us which ship is the target. You can see that, and these ships are separated by multiple ship lengths, the various British cruisers, and there's a shell spout from an Italian shell that's landed behind the next ship in line. They've got a spread of over a kilometer, which at that point, it's hopeless. You're never going to, if you hit anything, it's by pure luck. But in other battles, you have ships with the same guns, not necessarily the same ship, but ships with the same guns, particularly 10 and 15 inches, who might be firing at 10,000 yards further range than that. But the groupings are much, much, much tighter. The fact they're firing at insanely long range means the group is still not quite tight enough to actually hit anything, but it's much tighter. And if it was a fun, I respect the authors of that paper in Warship International, but my one concern I would raise with that is, if it was the shells are overly stabilized, you would expect that result from every single gun of that type, regardless of range, whereas.
And they'd have probably spotted in testing. You'd have thought they were. That's the sort of thing you would have spotted in testing.
Whereas what we tend to see seems to suggest that some shell batches were all over the place, and other shell batches they got were actually reasonably good. It's just that they never quite lucked into having a good batch of shells on a day when they were shooting at something approaching reasonable range. And it's one of the things I keep bringing up in my videos. Like, if they had decent shells, if they had shells from practically any other navy, the Battle of the Mediterranean may have gone completely differently, because
let's be honest, the battles of Sirte would be very painful for the Royal Navy.
There are so many battles where you have these pictures from various reporters on British ships of water spouts horizon to horizon, and there's the one ship that's the target in the center wondering whether or not they're even being shot at. If those groupings had been tighter because the shells were better, for whichever reason, those ships would have been hit. And a Town class, a Leander class, a Dido class, they're well-built ships. They are not designed to stand up to a 15-inch shell, or 2 or 3 or 6. So on such minor things do battles turn, and you add up number of ships that were straddled repeatedly like that, compensate for shell quality, and suddenly you realize the British could easily have lost half the Mediterranean fleet to the Italian Navy in the course of a few months. And then we suddenly be sitting here singing a very different tune.
With everything, generals, equipment, ships, tanks, the margins between earning a reputation for being brilliant and earning a reputation for being shit are actually pretty narrow generally, aren't they? It's just that
Yeah.
a couple of things go a different way. They have one little battle gets recorded a different way, and suddenly a reputation goes up or down. And because of that, which is leading us up to where we'll get into the don't spoil the narrative is the point we were going to bring up. But Jeff White just asked about to mention carriers. So I think Alex.
Yeah, let's be honest. I will say this, and this will get me into trouble. You'll read a lot about the Graf Zeppelin. You will not read so much in English about Aquila or Aquila, the aircraft carrier. Aquila, the aircraft carrier. And I'm going to put this. This is with me having done a PhD on the development of naval aviation, 1920s and 30s. My entire PhD thesis was on this: development of aircraft carriers and naval air power. So I've spent a lot of time and 100,000 words writing about this topic. So I know a thing or two. I've spent a lot of time with naval engineers, a lot of time with air engineers, and a lot of time around the Fleet Air Arm. And I can say this honestly. If you had to force me, gun to my head, of which one I would prefer to be on, I wouldn't even need a gun to my head. I would go to the Aquila. Every single time. It is a far better design of aircraft carrier. They never quite work out what the air group's going to be. They have lots of different ideas. But she is a far better designed ship for air operations. If you look at her plan, if you look at her air defenses, if you look at the guns they're going to fit on her, all the systems they are building for this ship, it is for a first generation aircraft carrier, even though it is a converted liner, it is a far, far better design than the Graf Zeppelin, which is supposedly a purpose-built ship.
True. But I would also add that the aircraft carrier was at least the Aquila was the decision to build it was taken in early 1941. I mean, it would have changed anything because you had to compose the air group. You didn't have aircraft specially built for operating on the aircraft carrier, so it wouldn't have played.
It could have changed one thing. There could have been a carrier versus carrier battle in European waters. That would have been a cool thing.
It could have provided sufficient air cover during Matapan and the operation the day before. But the key problem was the absence of airship coordination, and that the Air Force and the Navy don't speak. This was a much more important flaw than the having or not having an aircraft carrier. I think
the major advantage of having an aircraft carrier, and the Royal Navy will tell you this in World War II, and the US Navy will tell you this in World War II, and even to this day, you can have a lot of airfields around you like you do in the Mediterranean. The Italians have this, but it's coordination with them, and it's resupply the aircraft. Because the aircraft might still have fuel left, but it might well have run out of ammunition, so it might as well go home, in which case you're waiting for more aircraft to come out to you, and during that time you don't have air cover. And this is the whole point of an aircraft carrier. It's a big advantage for a fleet. It's basically your mobile supply base for your aircraft coming with you. It gives you air defense. And
true.
I think it gives, for the Italian admiral, it would have given them reconnaissance, which they would be able to control, possibly strike, which they'd have been able to control, and air defense, which they would have been able to control and would have gone with them wherever they went. So if they had decided to push, and this is the thing again, they have airfields, but they're only limited. There's spaces where they can't go with air cover, i.e. there are spaces in the Western Mediterranean where they are beyond their air cover, on the Eastern Mediterranean where they're beyond their air cover. And the thing is, if they'd had an aircraft carrier, they would have been there wouldn't have been safe areas for the British.
I think, to be honest, when you look at the various battles and the impact that aircraft, be they carrier or land-based, made on the specific battle itself, aside from land-based aircraft attacking the convoys and such like, if there was, I think there's probably one major engagement where I think having an aircraft carrier could have made a lot of difference, and I don't think an Italian aircraft carrier would have made a particular difference as an offensive unit, because most of the time the Allied forces tried to stay out of the central Mediterranean for a lot of the time, because that's where there were lots of Flieger Corp 10 and Regia Aeronautica aircraft, and the Italians tried to stay out of the extreme ends of the Mediterranean because that's where there were a lot of Allied aircraft, and so a lot of the battles are happening on the margins. But the one battle where there could have been a change is actually Matapan.
Yeah.
Because Matapan takes place outside of the cover of Axis aircraft, and you've got small attacks by albacores and swordfish, and of course it's one of their torpedoes that cripples Vittorio Veneto, and another one of their torpedoes that cripples Pola, and it's that crippling of Pola that leads to Matapan. So whilst a single Italian aircraft carrier probably wouldn't get very far trying to launch strikes against the British fleet, what it might have been able to do would be to put up a combat air patrol to break up those attacks by the British, which might have then allowed the Italians to withdraw in good order. But that's more of avoiding a defeat than giving them additional victories.
It would have given the British definitely a general pause for thought.
Yeah, we're also veering into counterfactual stuff now, which is fascinating as it is.
Maybe I can just add just on the aircraft carrier. So I've written a piece on the story of the aircraft carrier program of the Regia Marina.
Brilliant.
Thank you. No, just to summarize it. So after World War I, the Regia Marina starts looking at the hypothesis to build an aircraft carrier. And until 1923, they are very interested in the idea. But the thing is, after the war, the economy is in bad shape. There's no money for the Navy. And for instance, the Caracciolo class super dreadnought are scrapped. And only in 1925, so after Washington, after Mussolini has come to power, only in 1925 they have started a new naval construction. So for instance, the Trento class cruiser, which are the first heavier ships built after World War I. And there's a meeting of the admirals, of the committee of the admirals, and the session is also chaired by Mussolini, who's at the very first time he attends a meeting with the admirals, and they explore the possibility of building the aircraft carrier or building more Trento or other kinds of cruisers like the first Condottieri or the Zara, but the idea of the Zara was still in development. And they say, okay, the aircraft carrier it's a very good ship, but given the fact that we operate in the Mediterranean, it's maybe not super useful at the time, given the budget constraints. We need more cruisers, so let's build cruisers. Mussolini, who didn't understand anything of military affairs, said, okay, let's do this. And then they take this decision. And then in the 20s and in the early 30s, there are some independent admirals drafting designs, but there is no real push. And then after 1925, you have the Regia Aeronautica established, which jealously keeps all the aircraft, the control of the aircraft for itself. And so the Regia Marina is guilty of not really advocating for an independent air arm, so they give up at some point. Also because the Regia Aeronautica was built by Italo Balbo, which was a prominent member of the fascist elite. So don't bother Balbo. So there's a lot. There are lots of.
There's a lot of reasons, but basically an aircraft carrier for the Italian Navy is more about a force multiplier. And there was Martin Healy put, "How would an Italian aircraft carrier have survived? Look at Illustrious." Well, the point is, the British, just because your carriers will get bashed up doesn't mean they don't do a lot of operations beforehand. And that's the thing is, yes, it might have ended up getting sunk. It might have ended up getting damaged. The British lose several carriers damaged and sunk in the Mediterranean. They still keep sending them in there because you need them and because they're useful. It's not a good. Let's put it this way: in naval terms, getting a ship damaged or sunk is not a reason necessarily not to do it. It might be a factor in that, is it worth doing this if we're going to get this damaged? It might affect what we're going to do. But when we're fighting a naval war, it's not necessarily a factor. It's like when we were talking earlier about the top trumps versus top trumps analysis of battles, when that doesn't really apply to the Mediterranean. It's the same in the Mediterranean. Yes, my carrier might get damaged, but I still need my carrier because that gives me the freedom of movement and the operations. And the same things a carrier provides the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean is what it would provide the Italian Navy with. Because in the nicest way, coordinating with land-based air cover is lovely on paper. On paper, it always looks lovely and works well. But in reality, you have the transit time of the aircraft to you. You have the radio communications going backwards and forwards. And then you have the problems of the aircraft running out of ammunition and having to go back. Is there another aircraft on station? Whereas if it's on your carrier with you, basically those aircraft come down. And if necessary, they can be rearmed on deck and sent up as they're fighters. If necessary, if that's what you have to do to keep aircraft in the air, that's what you do. And you can do that, and they will be literally down for 5-10 minutes maximum.
Yeah, well, I think we should move on from the. I think we've done carriers. I mean, at least for this year, we can come back and do it again. I like the nature of that question there about the gunnery and gun barrels. Yes. Does one of you want to take that one?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, go on.
This was an issue, especially in some of the early Italian cruisers. When you look at photos of them, you'll notice the gun barrels on the twin 8-inch turrets are really close together. There were two factors to do with the guns that affected Italian gunnery early on. One of which was that, and the other of which was the sheer velocity of the shells that they were firing, because they were very big into their high velocity shells, and that led. Well, basically together led to a problem in that the displaced air that the shells actually, move out of their way, as well as the muzzle blast initially, interferes with the shell that's not coming out of that gun, and that affects the accuracy. Now, the Italians did notice this early on when they were doing commissioning trials for things like the Trento class, and they did have to dial back the velocity on the guns a little bit, which also helped extend the barrel life, because high velocity wears the barrels out very quickly. But the other thing they did is they had to introduce delay coils, which some viewers from my channel will be familiar with, which is basically where instead of firing both guns simultaneously, you fire one gun and then just a fraction of a second later you fire the other gun. And that's enough, because of the speed the shells are going at, that they don't interfere with each other as much. So it didn't entirely solve the problem, but it dialed the problem down to within kind of ballpark acceptable levels for the kind of the level of accuracy you'd expect for most navies. So it was a problem, but it was a solvable problem.
Okay. Well, so I think as we're getting an hour and a half now, we should look at the the don't spoil the narrative idea, which is
there's been a great question come up on that. If you look at Hollylingus, what they've been writing, basically because they all hid an harbour, so would be true for the imaginary carrier. The Italians didn't hide an harbour; they came out and fought. There's been, and I can understand why someone has that perspective. Hollylingus has also written, Italy should not have destroyed Austria in Model 1 because they deposed the only navy they could really score against. They scored against the Royal Navy. They scored against every navy that came into the Mediterranean. The Italian Navy was good.
There's a couple of points. I mean, obviously, when you look at the arc of improvements across the Allies in World War II, a lot of things we started getting right, 44, 45. The Italians don't have that luxury because they're out of the competition, aren't they? So we can only judge them by the half, 2/3 of the war, as opposed to us. 44 is, in all terms, is the year we start. Everything gets better. The marks of Spitfires are the best we've ever had. The marks of Mustangs, Sherman tanks, guns, everything I would argue is getting pretty good by that point. So that's not having an effect. But we're stuck with this idea of these reputations. And one of the things I wanted to address, because I'm a big movie buff and I go on Fighting on Film with Matthew and Robbie, talk about that, is as a war, we also deal with the fact that there's the propaganda at the time. In the war, after war, Italians run away. We all know the jokes. I talked about this with Neil Lawrence on the Folgoy show. I know these are made in the war, but it's this idea the Italians are the weaker nation, blah blah blah. But the thing I wanted to mention, I'll bring you guys in again, is let's take the film The Valiant. Now, I'm sure there's people watching this who've never heard of this war film. This is a 1962 movie. John Mills, Robert Shaw, who's just about to go and make From Russia with Love, John Melion, the Australian actors in it. It has never been released on DVD, VHS, Blu-ray in the UK. I think it may have been shown once on TV like 50 years ago. The BFI, the British Film Institute, classify it as a lost film. is there any connection between that film being lost and the fact it shows the Italian Navy getting one over on the British? Is there something to do?
It's the forgotten war, and it's the forgotten power, forgotten navy. It's let's be honest, the Mediterranean is this British versus Italian affair, and the British don't tend to make that many movies about what they lose, and the Italians, let's put it this way, no one makes many Italian. The Italian movies tend to be in Italian, which is for love of good, because I do love some Italian movies are wonderful, but I have to admit my Latin is stronger than my Italian, so I have to put the subtitles on to be able to follow them. But those movies don't get that much circulation, and it's building against the narrative, because as you said earlier, if there's it's a lot of battles in 1 week, the really big famous one gets it. Well, actually, it's not so much the really big famous one, it's the one which has the most high profile participants.
Yeah.
And you can honestly say World War II, the Royal Navy, their participations on certain battles, they're not as high profile as other navies coming to war, because the narrative after the war is that World War II is the end of the British Empire and it's now the rise of the Americans. And we all know it's actually more complicated than that. And actually, the Royal Navy doesn't realize it's the rise of the Americans until about the 1950s, because as far as they're concerned, they did very well in World War II and they've come out of it looking pretty darn strong. Thank you very much. And yes, we're having to cut back because, well, we're having to make cuts, but we had to do that after World War I. This is something we understand and we've done. And, it's a fun part of the world. Now, I'm not disappearing. I'm getting someone.
I'm just gonna ask our resident Italian here, because you deal in English language as well, but obviously you're talking to us tonight. But do you think English speaking historians misunderstand the Italian role in World War II? That's kind of a yes or no question, really.
I'm not sure. I can't answer because I haven't read so much literature in English on that. So
yeah, but how
I can tell about the perception I get in the general debate, the documentaries I watched in the past. I don't watch any documentaries now. But
Godwin's law is that any argument on the internet always ends up with someone mentioning Hitler. Well, the thing is, I find on Twitter or Facebook is that whenever the Mediterranean theatre is this discussion, and then the Italians come in, at some point, someone will make the Italians running away or their tanks. That's the thing we're working against here. Is that people?
I remember once we were having a conversation, Paul, and you said to me, every time they want to add an interesting character into a comic about World War II, they're Italian. The Germans are always the baddie. You can predict them. The Italians are the ones you can't predict whether they're going to be good soldiers, bad soldiers, brave.
It's a simplification of the reality.
And I got that from the Commando writers. When I did my comic shows, I think it was Ferg Handley, who's written over 500 Commandos, said they're a great narrative plot device, putting an Italian officer in early, because as you said there, you don't know which way you're going to go. If you put an SS guy, he's got to be bad, he's got to be evil. If you put a British commando, he's got to be heroic. But an Italian, you can have them switch sides, you can have them run away, you can have them do whatever you want. It's a really good writing trick to keep the viewer or the reader, in this case of comics, guessing. I think that's had an effect. We're in this narrative. We're in an era where Italian Navy, it came up with Neil Lawrence, who's watching about the Folgore. So is it, you're the naval experts, not me. Do we need to just readdress generally the Italian Navy and the Italian military? And if so, who's going to do it? And
we do have to readdress the Italian Navy.
I one of the reasons I started the Twitter, and it started at first on Instagram and then it moved on Twitter. In Instagram, I only covered the Regia Marina, and on Twitter also the Army and the Air Force. But I also felt this need to I saw that there was not so much written or this told about the Italians in World War II in English, and even in Italian there is something, but still in the big debate around World War II and YouTube, Twitter, the debate in English is lacking these points of view, or people looking at the facts, at the actual history. So I'm doing my very little part in that, and I like it.
We can go to today as well, because if you consider the modern Italian Navy is one of the best navies in NATO and in Europe, and let's be honest, and it's one of the most capable as well if you look at its ships and the number of ships. And how often is it talked about?
And also they have
we talk about the French, we talk about the Germans, we talk about how often do we talk about the Italian Navy? And they're very good.
And also the contemporary, let's say, Navy SEALs of the Italian Navy they build on the experience of the 10th MAS flotilla, so the frogmen, those crazy people who operated the maiali.
I think it comes back to a lot of it. It's what I mentioned at the outset, which is there just isn't that much published about the Italian Navy, which means it's very easy for the narrative to be dominated by people inferring stuff off of the performance of other elements of the Italian military, which isn't really fair. And I think there's partly also the fact that Italy bows out of the war in 43, which it kind of it engenders this kind of perception that, the Germans stuck out all the way to 1945. The Italians went a couple of years earlier, therefore they mustn't have been as good, because apparently the duration of how long you last in a war is a measure of how good you actually were, when that's not actually anything close to the truth.
Actually, the Allies were very, very happy the Italians decided to switch sides. It made their lives a lot easy. Let's be honest, the British Pacific Fleet couldn't have been the British Pacific Fleet if they'd started to have all those ships in the Mediterranean.
And then, I think the other thing is what Giulio was saying, is the sources they're not there. There's some very good articles, very good scholarly articles in both the Warship and Warship International journals. There's some very good articles in there, but I guess the easiest way to illustrate it, I guess, would be just off screen, kind of up here is my easy reference German shelf. So this is where the German reference books that I look at the most are stored. So if we wanted to say look at German battleships, so there's a whole section actually in German. It's a German book set which obviously covers them. Then I've got German warships by Eric Groner. Then there's German battleships. The latest one by Garski, Dulin, and Duran's Battleship Bismarck. German warships of the Second World War. Then you've got Koop's series, which has separate ones for Scharnhorst and Bismarck. And then back over there's the old Dulin and Garski ones on Axis battleships that cover Bismarck. So all of those cover Axis, the German battleships, mostly the Bismarck and some of them the Scharnhorsts. And they're all good books. Most of them are relatively easy to get copies of. Now show me how many good books there are in English on the Littorios. So far, I've come across one.
One, I would say one.
That's the one by. And again, I apologize for probably butchering his name, but is it Bagnasco?
Erminio Bagnasco, yes.
Bagnasco. There you go. So there's weird lettering. I apologize, but so
this one.
That's the thing. It's such a small list of books. You have it sitting next to you.
Yeah, it's like that. That is the one good book on the Littorios. He's got one on
all three of us have that book.
Yeah. He's got one on the Caio Duilios and Andrea Doria's coming out soon in English, which is on pre-order. But until that comes out, good luck finding a detailed book on in English on those battleships. It's like that's 2/3 of the Italian battle fleet. And
this is a pertinent question for Giulio, really, about were there archives that just didn't survive the war? Is there because of bombing and you want to address that one? Just the fact
surviving of the archives, you mean?
Yeah.
A lot. All the data on which I based the graphs that you showed before are based on the Navy records, because the thing is, Rome was not heavily bombed as Berlin, as you may know and you can imagine, and so most of the documents from all the ministries were intact. So there were no major losses. And
so
and there are huge records I can testify to of the fighting Mediterranean War in National Archives. They have there's books as well, which are from the British Standard, but they're just not well read. The Britannia History.
We're getting to the crux. If there are plenty of archives in Italian, in Italy, there's archives, the National Archives. I guess the Americans have probably got some stuff as well. I don't know, but if there's all this stuff here, we're coming down this idea that perhaps the public don't really want to have their view of the narrative changed. They're kind of happy with what they they know.
But you have also the linguistic barrier. That's we have to go with that. Maybe Italians don't bother. At least in the past, they didn't bother to publish in English because maybe there was no market or whatsoever, and only Bagnasco and few others published something. I think Maurizio Brescia wrote Mussolini's Navy, which was I think older than Bagnasco's book. But then from the English side, nobody came to read the archives in Italian, and nobody else translated it.
So the question before we kind of end things up is: do we think the narrative can be changed, or is it too deeply it's set in stone now? You know what I mean? I always think of that example of everyone thinks Napoleon was short, and Napoleon wasn't short, but the world has decided he was short now. Like, how many times academic?
And there's an even complex named about short men, which is entirely called the Napoleon.
Yeah, complex. And Custer at Little Bighorn. Even I think there's a centre at the Little Bighorn where someone painted did a painting of Custer with his hair as it would do. He'd had it there. They all had their hair cut off because of worries about whatever it was, collar or something. Head lice. So Custer died with a screw cut and no long wispy beard. But they had to put a painting back in again with Custer with long hair and a wispy beard because people didn't know who it was. And so even the museum had to admit defeat and go, okay, no, the public has decided Custer looks like this. So is it too late to rescue, if you like, the Italian reputation? Is it now too deeply set now? Or is there going to be a chance in 10 years' time where we can reevaluate?
I think in the internet area, it's the opportunity to have it because we can have easier access to archives. We can translate them easier in an easier way than it was before. You just need the will to do so.
Yeah, there's an encouraging thing we'll kind of end on is that someone's asking about details on Italian battleship books. So there we are. Maybe at least one person watching this has gone into this and now come out of it with an interest to go in a bit more detail. And that's all we can ever hope to achieve in a limited format like that, is just raise a subject, get people to think about it, reconsider a little bit, and then go off to do their own investigation. And there's plenty of videos on your channel track to go and look at as well, and your wonderful work on Twitter and your blogs, Giulio, for people to look up. So there is information. There are some good resources, but maybe not that traditional sense. It hasn't. Your big main players, your Anthony Beavers and people, haven't tackled it and brought it to the forefront yet. Maybe.
To be fair, that's quite an advantage in some cases.
I mean, in terms of Beaver, Bessie doesn't touch. I'm not a great.
I just remember Mark Stille, an American historian. He wrote three small books: one on the Italian cruisers, one on the battleships, and one on the destroyers. They're fairly nice basic guides, not as detailed as Bagnasco's book, but they are very good starter.
Yeah, well, what we'll do, folks, is I'll get these guys to email me, message me with a list of books, and I'll add them to the YouTube description and update it when we're done at some point, so people can go off and do some more reading. But I think as we're coming up for 2 hours, I think we should kind of call it ahead. But final kind of closing remarks, each of you, about something, some point, simple kind of point you'd like to make about the Italian Navy that you think is important to kind of end on. So we'll leave you to last, Giulio, because you're the Italian. We'll go to Alex first, then Drat, then Giulio. So Alex, kind of closing remark. You know, you've got the jury ahead of you. You want to make the case the Italian Navy is misunderstood. What's your closing statement?
My closing statement would be this: we judge performance of navies by the opponents they face. We judge people in battles and history by the opponents they face. When talking about Scipio Africanus, we judge him as great because of him fighting Hannibal and him winning. When we're talking about Napoleon and Wellington, Wellington is good because he manages to beat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, which not many people have managed to beat Napoleon. When we're talking about the Royal Navy and the Battle of Trafalgar, the reason why Nelson goes down in history for this great battle is because he's taking on the Spanish and French navies, which are considered good at the time, although, let's be honest, the French command structure was weird as anything. The point is, the Royal Navy is one of the best navies in the world. We all acknowledge that in the 1920s and 1930s and in World War II. It's one of the best. It would not have devoted so much combat power, so much capability, so much of its best personnel and ships and everything else available to the Mediterranean if the Italian Navy had been a walkover. Let's be honest, if the Italian Navy had been a walkover, the Royal Navy would probably have sent in the R-class battleships and they'd have been dealing everything else with the ships they needed elsewhere. No, they have the best battleships they have available in 1939, 1940. Let's be honest, 1941. These are the best ones they have available. They have the Rodney and Nelson going
something for Drac to say, Alex. Come on.
It's massive. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's Drac. I mean,
Yeah, and well, I think it's similar to Dr. Clarke, but I would probably put it on an even more personal level. Whilst I didn't have any relatives personally who fought in the Mediterranean War, I did have one of my great uncles who was fighting in the desert, so was affected by the Mediterranean War. And I think, building on Dr. Clarke's point, is a false narrative that the Italian Navy were a bunch of people who hid in port and didn't really do all that much and weren't very good. It dishonors all those on both sides who lost their lives, because there were a lot of people in the Royal Navy and in the Italian Navy who lost their lives in the Mediterranean conflict. And it dishonors the Italian dead to say that they died as useless failures, effectively, because they weren't. They were professionals, they were doing their job, and they did it well. And it also dishonors the British dead, the French dead, the various free navies who all fought there, because ultimately there was, there's a lot of people who didn't come home. There's a lot of people who fought very hard for that campaign. And if they were fighting against a navy that wasn't worth it and basically could have been walked over at any point, well, what was the point of their deaths then? How can you be proud of effectively throwing away thousands of lives for something that apparently, according to the narrative, never needed to be done? People need to stop and think about that for a second. As Dr. Clarke said, you are in some ways defined by the quality of your enemies. And everyone who fought in that conflict did not go to their grave thinking, oh, well, that should have been much easier.
Yeah. I mean, that...
Great
perfect, succinctly, and and Neil Lawrence made the same point about the Folgore in Al Alamein about the British opponents, saying of all the guys they fought against, it was Italians that they were had the most respect for. So we've done a lot this week looking at that. So Giulio, as our only Italian, it's you to represent your entire nation now. So closing remark. What?
I feel the gravitas. Okay, yeah. So if you want to start changing your mindset, your idea on that, I encourage you to start looking at the small stories, like stories of single actions of destroyers, submarines, like we recalled before the story of the Perla, this submarine who escaped the East African bases and then circumvented Africa and made it to Bordeaux. The stories of all these destroyers who basically were depleted in the Convoy War. You have insane acts of courage by destroyer commanders charging along superior British formation, like more destroyers, light cruisers, just to protect the convoy or other unarmed ships, and most of them never came home. So I keep discovering stories of small ships there and there in the Mediterranean who fought against the odds, and these people sacrificed their lives in a way that I don't think we are able to do so today. So I'm always impressed by this adds. So I encourage you to look at the stories of torpedo boats, destroyers. Yeah. Of course, the 10th MIS, the Frogmen are. There's an event barely told about the attempt to destroy the infrastructure of the port of Malta by the 10th MIS, an attempt who ended up in failure. But basically, you have 40 special trained men dying for nothing, but just risking their life, throwing themselves into these explosive motorboats, charging the harbor infrastructure and being depleted by the coastal fire. You read these stories and you just say, wow.
Well, I think if one thing, I mean, the viewing numbers have been really good tonight. And I think if there's one thing that's come out of it is to bring you on again, either as a group or individually, and we'll look at some of these actions because clearly there's interest there. I'm really pleased that this show has had, I think, a lot of coming from Drax's channel. I think they've all
I'd love to
come over, but I don't care where they come from as long as they stay. That's the only thing. I think it's the point, it has opened the door to doing some more stuff, and because my channel is a broad World War II history channel. I think the Navy experts have known some of this already. But I think there's definitely some of my regular viewers who've come away from tonight's show going, actually, you've changed a little bit about my perception. And that's important. That's why what we're doing here and what you're doing, Drac, and what you're doing, Alex, is important, because every one person you kind of bring in and you change their perception is a little victory. So yeah, I think we ought to end it there. But absolutely, this has been really, really fascinating. And
thank you for having us.
We can thank you for coming on, because I couldn't do this on my own, but it's just been really, really extraordinary. I'm going to just say goodbye to the folks and say what we've got coming up tomorrow, then I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, we've got one more show in Italy week. That's tomorrow. We're talking about the Battle of Medicina. So that's Julian Whippy coming on. We're talking about 2-hour battles. I said at the top of the show, we're just talking about one little action for one small town, village almost, Gurkhas and 14th, 20th Hussars. That'll be a cracking way to finish the week. Then it's strategic bombing week next week, which I've got to get myself working on, because that's only starting on Monday. But right now it remains me to say thank you to our guests. So thank you, Giulio over in Italy. Thank you, Drac. Thank you, Alex. It's been really good. So remember, folks, check out the links to Drac's channel, Alex's blogs and channels, Giulio's Twitter feed, blah, blah, blah. Check me out on Patreon. Check us out on social media. Perhaps we'll do a tweet and we'll have a discussion we'll continue some themes in a tweet later on or something. I don't know. But thank you for watching, everybody. I will see you all again on World War II TV. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Drac. Thank you, Giulio. I will see you all again. I'm ending the stream. I'm going to go have a beer because I think I've deserved it, as have you. So,
thank you.
See you all next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.